The round hit the rock 6 inches from Emily's face. She didn't flinch. She pressed her cheek harder against the stock and held her breath. Beside her, Corporal Reyes made a wet sound that wasn't a word. "Reyes." She kept her eye on the scope. "Talk to me." He didn't answer. The wind had shifted. She'd called 3 to 5 knots left. Now it was something else entirely. And the enemy shooter had already known that. He'd adjusted before she did. She swept the ridgeline. Nothing. Rock, shadow, wind. Then she stopped. The angle of entry, the patience between rounds, the doctrine behind it. She knew this. She had been taught it. 3 months earlier, Fort Benning, Georgia. The bus smelled like diesel and other people's ambition. Emily Carter sat in the third row with her rucksack between her boots and her eyes on the Georgia tree line moving past the window. Pine trees, red clay catching early light and turning it copper. A hawk riding a thermal above the fence line of Fort Benning's outer perimeter, patient and unhurried, watching the ground below with the focused attention of something that understood waiting as a form of work. She had requested this assignment twice. The first request was denied. Insufficient field time in current MOS. The second was approved without comment, which she'd learned in 9 years of Army service meant someone senior had made a call they didn't want documented. Approvals without comment were either gifts or tests. She had learned not to distinguish between the two until she understood the situation fully. She was 27 years old, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 commendation she didn't discuss, 1 incident she discussed even less. She was here because she was good with a rifle. She was also here because being good with a rifle had once gotten someone killed who shouldn't have been. And those 2 facts existed simultaneously inside her without resolving into anything clean or manageable. Fort Benning in August felt like breathing through a wet sock. The humidity came off the Georgia lowlands and settled on everything: skin, uniform fabric, the inside of the lungs, with a persistence that the body eventually stopped fighting and simply accommodated. By the time the bus stopped at the gate and an MP checked the manifest against 17 IDs with methodical efficiency, Emily's collar had already darkened. She noted the MP's precision without comment. Old habit. She cataloged competence the way others catalog threats. Not from suspicion, but from the understanding that competence and threat were deeply related concepts in her line of work. 17 candidates assembled on a concrete pad outside the sniper school building in the August heat. 14 men, 3 women. She noted the ratio without emotion. She had been noting ratios like that for her entire career. A sergeant major read names from a clipboard. Nobody spoke. There was a particular quiet that gathered in places where people understood the next few weeks were going to cost something significant and were privately calculating whether they had enough to spend. Emily recognized this quiet from a runway in Kuwait in 2018 and from a street corner in Mosul in 2020. Then Master Sergeant Jack Donovan walked out of the building and the quiet changed register. He was not a large man. In Emily's experience, the ones who had actually done the work at the highest level rarely were. 5'10", lean with old muscle rather than gym muscle, the density that came from decades of moving through difficult terrain with heavy equipment. Close-cropped gray hair, the kind of tan that came from outdoor operations across multiple climates over multiple decades, with nothing recreational about it. He moved with a slight drag in his left leg. Not a limp. A limp implied the injury was still winning. This was something else. A deliberate integration of limitation into movement. You accounted for the tool. You did not apologize for it. He stood before the group and looked at each candidate for approximately 2 seconds. When his eyes reached Emily, they stopped for 3. She held his gaze without moving. 40% of you will not finish this course, he said. Flat, functional. The flatness of a weather report, not a threat. That is not a scare tactic. That is a statistic I have watched hold for 11 consecutive classes. The ones who leave do not leave because they are bad shooters. Every one of you can shoot. You are here because someone in your chain of command believes you can shoot under conditions that would make most people's hands shake so badly they could not operate a zipper. He paused and let it settle. I do not care what you believe about yourselves. I care what you do when I am watching and when I am not. There is no difference between those two states in this building. Clear? Clear, Sergeant. 17 voices, ragged. Say it like you mean it, or don't say it at all. The group found the register. Clear, Sergeant. Donovan nodded once. Acknowledgement of a minimum threshold, not approval. Get your gear, 6 minutes. He walked back inside without looking at them again. The barracks smelled like old wood and cleaning solvent and the institutional history of people who had slept here and left nothing personal behind. Emily took a top bunk near the window. Better airflow, sight lines to the door, proximity to the fire escape. Automatic, not deliberated. Her bunkmate was Staff Sergeant Tara Voss, combat controller, on a joint service cross-training slot. Red hair in a severe braid. The unhurried confidence of someone who had spent years being the most dangerous person in rooms where everyone else held the same belief about themselves. Not arrogance. Arrogance required insecurity as its foundation. Voss simply knew what she knew. Carter, Voss said, extending a hand. Voss. Firm, brief, no performance. Voss organized her kit with the easy efficiency of long practice. Everything placed by muscle memory, not thought. You hear anything about Donovan before you got here? Some. My SF contact said he wrote 3 chapters of the current field manual. More confirmed long-range kills in operational environments than anyone on active duty or recently retired. She laid out her cleaning kit in a precise row. Also said he's been recalled from retirement twice in 8 years because nobody else knows what he knows. And, Emily said, and he failed his own son out of this course 4 years ago. Voss paused. Don't know if it's true, but it's the kind of story that gets repeated because it feels true. What makes it feel true? Voss considered. The fact that you can believe it of him after 5 minutes of watching him. Whether he actually did it is almost beside the point. That night, Emily lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling joists and thought about a street in Mosul and a figure in a doorway and the half-second that preceded a decision she had spent 2 years trying to correctly understand. She rotated the memory like a problem she was looking for the right angle on. Faster would have been wrong. Slower had been impossible, given the situation geometry. The answer was neither. The answer was something else she hadn't found a word for yet. I care what you do when I am watching and when I am not. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Her body had learned to take sleep when it was available. Conditions were rarely right. Sleep was still necessary. The first stalking exercise began at 04:30. Donovan briefed in pre-dawn darkness with a red lens flashlight and a topographic map that flexed in the morning wind. 800 meters of mixed terrain, scrub brush, low native grass, 2 creek beds running perpendicular to the objective, 40 meters of gradual elevation change. 2 observers on a ridgeline with binoculars, spotting scopes, and unlimited patience. You have 4 hours, Donovan said. If I can see you move, you fail the lane. If I can see equipment shine, you fail the lane. If I can see your barrel against the sky, you fail the lane. If you cough, sneeze, or breathe in a pattern I can hear at 200 meters, I will factor that into your evaluation. He refastened the map. The ground is wet from last night's rain. You will be covered in Georgia clay before you are 20 meters in. If that bothers you, there is a bus to the airport every 2 hours. Nobody moved toward the bus. A green flare popped against the lightning sky. 17 candidates began moving in whatever direction training and instinct directed them. Emily did not move. She lay in a shallow depression behind a clump of native grass she had identified during the brief. 18 inches of profile reduction, wet and cold, and she watched the ridgeline. She was looking for the observer pattern. The two senior NCOs Donovan had positioned, Staff Sergeant Kwan and Sergeant First Class Harrell, were at a low sandbag emplacement barely visible in the pre-dawn light. She could see the slight rhythmic movement of optics sweeping left and right with the regularity of trained behavior. She began timing. 40 seconds left, 11 seconds right, brief center pause, repeat. She timed it 7 consecutive cycles to confirm stability. People believed they were being random when they were being rhythmic. Rhythm was habit. Habit was exploitable. She began to move in the left window, slow, 3 meters in 10 minutes. Silhouette below the grass line, rifle across her forearms in low crawl configuration. The clay was cold against her elbows and knees. It soaked through her uniform within the first 100 meters and smelled like iron in old rain. She was not thinking about the cold. She was thinking about the window. Donovan materialized in her peripheral vision without sound. 2 meters. He was in a low crouch that produced no noise and had arrived with no detectable approach. Close enough that she could hear his controlled breathing. "Why are you stopped?" "Pattern recognition," she said, matching his register exactly. "They sweep 42 left, 11 right. I'm in the left window." A pause. "How long did it take you to time it?" 40 minutes. Another pause, longer. "Most candidates move in the first 5. They get detected in the first 10. Already moving away, silent as fog off water. Don't get arrogant about your 40 minutes. Timing the pattern and successfully exploiting it are not the same skill." She filed that distinction. She made it to 200 meters before Harrell's scope caught a reflection off her bolt handle in the strengthening daylight, and she was called out. Third furthest in the class. At the debrief, Donovan did not mention her distance. He talked about the 2 candidates detected inside the first 100 meters and the one who had increased pace in the final approach, when the objective was close enough to feel reachable, and patience was most psychologically difficult to maintain. "The correct thing," Donovan said, looking at no one specifically, "is always inconvenient. If it were convenient, it would not require discipline." 2 weeks in, Donovan ran what the candidates had taken to calling the philosophical session. A classroom, chairs, fluorescent lights humming off pitch, a whiteboard. He stood in front of them and wrote without preamble, "One shot changes a war." "Not one battle," he said, capping the marker. "A war. Tell me why that's true, if it is." Candidates offered answers in order of confidence. He listened to each with complete neutrality. High-value target elimination, psychological pressure on enemy units, force multiplication. He nodded without validating, which created its own kind of pressure in the room. When it came to Emily, she said, "Because of what it doesn't do." He gave her his full attention. "Explain." "Indirect fire kills in patterns. Area weapons create destruction across a zone. A single precision shot delivers something different. Information at lethal velocity. It tells the enemy, we know exactly where you are, what you're doing, and we chose this moment from all available moments." She kept her voice level. "That's not just a kill. It changes how the enemy moves, plans, and what positions they're willing to hold. One shot can make a battalion act like they've already lost, because they understand they're being watched with precision they can't match or defend against." The room was quiet. "And the liability," Donovan said, "proportional to the power. Precision requires certainty, and certainty is a form of arrogance." She found the words carefully. "Get it wrong, and you haven't just missed. You've told the enemy your intelligence is bad, your shooter hesitates, your capability is overstated. You've handed them information about your weakness at the moment you tried to demonstrate strength." The next part came out flatter than the rest. "Or you've hit something you shouldn't have, and that has its own kind of cost." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Donovan held her gaze for a moment that extended past assessment. Then he turned and wrote on the board, "Precision requires certainty. Certainty is a form of arrogance." "Write this down," he said to the room. "This is both your purpose and your permanent liability. Not a tension you resolve, a tension you manage for the rest of your career." He set the marker down. "Anyone who tells you there's a resolution hasn't been doing this long enough." The message arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before course end. Emily was field stripping her M40A6 at the cleaning station. Bolt out, barrel clear, when Sergeant Major Rourke appeared in the doorway and said Donovan wanted her. She set the components down in their spatial relationship on the mat and followed without asking why. The administrative building was air-conditioned aggressively, too cold in summer, retrofitted, and never properly calibrated. Donovan stood over a laptop at the central table. Beside him, a man in civilian clothes, government fit, neither too casual nor too tactical. Hard eyes, practiced stillness. A folder on the table with Defense Intelligence Agency routing stamps on the cover. "Sit down, Carter." She sat. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room without authorization." He waited for her nod. "We have had 3 KIA in the last 6 weeks at FOB Salerno, Helmand Province. All headshots, all between 800 and 1100 meters, all during daylight transitional periods, dawn or dusk, when light is ambiguous and shadows are long. All single shots, no follow-up fire." She was already building the picture in her head, not from what he was saying, but from what the data implied about the shooter's patience, discipline, and situational awareness. The ballistic analysis came back 48 hours ago. His jaw was tight in the way she'd learned to read as controlled anger. Not rage, something more disciplined. The methodology is specific, not just good shooting, a particular system, a particular sequence of environmental calculations that produces a distinctive signature in the shot pattern and impact data. He placed a document in front of her. She recognized the field manual formatting before she recognized the content. "This is curriculum material," she said. "This is my curriculum," Donovan said. "Written 2003 to 2007. Classified until 2019. Declassified as part of a NATO doctrine sharing initiative." He sat down across from her for the first time. The act of sitting changed the register. This was no longer a briefing. "Someone is using my methodology to kill American soldiers." The DIA man cleared his throat. "We assess the shooter was trained using these documents during the Allied access window. Probably Georgian Army sniper training, 2020 or 2021. What we can confirm is the ballistic signature, the way they calculate, the way they pace shots, the patience between engagements." "Why are you telling me?" Emily asked. Donovan looked at her directly. "Because I'm being sent to Salerno as technical consultant, because you're the best candidate in this class, and you have combat background in theater-adjacent operations." He paused. "And because you asked me last week, after the wind call exercise, whether patience was a virtue or a technique." She remembered asking it, standing in the shadow of the range house, the question finding its way from thought into speech almost accidentally. "I want you on the deployment rotation," Donovan said. "Voluntary. You can decline without affecting your evaluation." Emily looked at the document. 3 soldiers dead at ranges requiring extraordinary patience and a specific, studied methodology created to save American lives. "When do we leave?" she said. He found her that evening at the range, running dry fire in the last of the daylight. She was working trigger control. Slow, consistent squeeze, natural respiratory pause, consistent cheek weld. She heard him approach from 30 meters out, the compression of gravel under his boot, and kept working. He sat on a sandbag 20 meters behind her and watched without speaking. "You have a tell," he said. She lowered the rifle. "What tell?" Left shoulder drops 2 millimeters before you break the shot. Compensatory, developed in urban operations where you were indexed against a wall. At short range, it's invisible. At 1,000 meters, 2 millimeters of inconsistency in your mount is the difference between a hit and a miss that tells the enemy exactly where you're lying. She brought the rifle up, anchored the left shoulder deliberately, drove it into the stock, ran 5 dry-fire repetitions with specific attention to the contact point she'd been unconsciously neglecting. "Better," he said. "Not fixed. The habit is old. 3 weeks of deliberate correction before the new pattern begins to compete with it." She lowered the rifle and looked at him. The light was going amber at the tree line. "When you found out someone was using your doctrine to kill Americans, what was the first thing you felt?" The question sat in the warm Georgia air. Donovan picked up a piece of gravel and turned it in his fingers, looking at it with the attention of someone really considering something else. "Responsible," he said. "That's not a feeling, that's an assessment." "No," he agreed. He set the pebble down carefully. "It's not a feeling. The feeling underneath doesn't have a clean word." He was quiet. Pride that the methodology worked exactly as designed. Horror at what it was working on. Both at once, which English doesn't handle gracefully. He stood, the left leg taking its additional beat. "In 40 years of service, I have never felt anything cleanly. Everything arrives mixed." He moved toward the building. 0530 at the armory. Bring everything for 60 days. She sat in the last of the light and thought about what it meant to build something well enough that it could be turned against you. The C-17 was loud and cold and smelled like hydraulic fluid and institutional coffee. Emily slept 3 hours over the Atlantic. She woke to turbulence and lay still in the cargo webbing, feeling the aircraft move through unstable air, and thought about what she was flying toward, not with dread, but with the specific alertness of a system coming online for a task requiring everything she had. Donovan didn't sleep. She woke to find him at the fold-down table near the cargo ramp, reading by a green, shielded notebook light. A thick sheaf of densely annotated pages. After a moment, she recognized the format. After-action reports, Army Standard. His own by the thickness. Decades of them. He was reviewing his own operational history, turning pages with deliberate care, pausing at some, moving quickly through others. Looking for something. She didn't disturb him. They landed at Bagram, transited to Kandahar, caught a rotary flight to FOB Salerno as the sun dropped toward the western ridgeline and turned the landscape the color of old brass. Salerno was smaller than the intelligence brief had suggested. A compact arrangement of HESCO barriers and prefab structures on a flat plain, with mountains rising sharply to the north and east. Terrain that made overwatch positions obvious, approach routes predictable, and a skilled, patient shooter very comfortable. Colonel Marcus Webb met them at the landing pad. 50 years old, compressed with the energy of a man who hadn't slept adequately in weeks and had stopped hiding it. "Donovan," a handshake that communicated genuine respect. "Appreciate you coming." In the TOC, Webb pulled up the incident map. 3 red pins in a rough northern arc. He walked them through the timeline, the casualty reports, the terrain analysis. Emily listened and watched Donovan simultaneously. He was not looking at the map. He was looking at the space around it, the relationships between terrain features, the way elevation and light angle and distance intersected at the times of each incident. "Pull up the ballistic reconstruction on the second incident," Donovan said. Webb brought it up. Donovan leaned in. His eyes moved across the data with the speed of someone reading a language they were fluent in. He stopped at a margin notation. "There, the shooter corrected for Coriolis effect at 900 meters. Most don't bother below 1200. The correction is small. But this target was moving laterally, which amplifies the apparent deviation enough to make the correction meaningful." He straightened. "That specific calculation, correcting Coriolis for lateral target movement at under 1,000 meters, is not in the published manual. Where is it? Emily asked. A supplemental document, 2015, NATO SOF cross-training program, classified, 12 copies to senior NCO sniper instructors at Allied commands. He looked at Webb. Distribution list? 11 copies accounted for, Webb said. 12th went to a Georgian Army sniper school in 2016. The school was compromised in 2019. Several instructors subsequently recruited by a private military company operating across Central Asia. The company dissolved on paper in 2022. We're still tracking personnel. The TOC was very quiet. Emily looked at the 3 red pins. The patience required. 3 separate operations, 3 separate windows. The selection of timing, position, target, each a calculation and a deliberate choice. He's not done, she said. Both men looked at her. 3 kills in 6 weeks, spaced to avoid establishing a predictable response pattern. That's a campaign with a logic behind it, not opportunistic shooting. She studied the terrain overlay. He's making a point, building towards something, or he has a specific reason to maintain position in this operational area. Probably more than one of those simultaneously. She looked at Donovan. He's going to shoot again, and based on the Coriolis correction, he knows things about your methodology that you didn't publish. He's been studying more than the document. Donovan held her gaze. So have we, he said. Now. The mountain air at this altitude tasted like metal and cold. Emily noticed it the first morning she climbed to the overwatch position, a flat shelf of rock 2 kilometers northeast of Salerno, accessible only by a goat path that took 40 minutes to navigate in daylight and twice that in darkness. She made the climb 3 times in the first 5 days, twice at night, once in a wind that came off the peaks with enough force to require leaning into it. From the shelf, she could see the valley floor where the second KIA had occurred. She could see the supply road connecting Salerno to the district center 8 kilometers north. She could identify 4 potential firing positions that offered the correct combination of elevation, concealment, and egress, exactly the criteria Donovan had taught her in Benning's classroom while Georgia heat pressed flat against the windows. She marked all 4 on her map and cross-referenced each with the incident timings. None of them lined up cleanly. The shooter had not used any of the obvious positions, which was itself information. Her spotter was Corporal Danny Reyes, 24, from Albuquerque, with competitive shooting background that made him technically proficient and an eagerness to call shots that outpaced his certainty. She'd told him on their first morning together, "Don't confirm until you're certain. Wrong confirmation is worse than silence." He'd nodded seriously. She wasn't sure he'd internalized the distinction yet. Some things required contact to internalize. "Winds 12 knots off the eastern ridge," Reyes said, lying prone beside her on their 4th morning. "Variable in the lower valley. Hard to call below 800 meters. "I know," Emily said. She was watching the northern ridgeline through her scope, not looking for a specific shape or movement, watching the way the terrain breathed. Where shadows moved in patterns that didn't match the wind, where dust lifted at angles that didn't match the surrounding air. The small inconsistencies that a patient observer produced without intending to. Nothing resolved into anything. "He's not there today," Reyes said. The confidence of someone who'd been watching for 4 hours and found nothing. "You don't know that. We've been here since before dawn." Donovan held a position for 31 hours in Al-Anbar province, Emily said. He mentioned it the way someone mentions a commute. She kept her eye on the scope. "The fact that we haven't seen anything means nothing except that we haven't seen anything." Reyes was quiet for a while. Then, "Do you think the guy we're hunting was actually trained from Donovan's manual?" "Yes." "That's messed up." "Yes," she agreed without moving her eye from the scope. She kept watching. The mountain kept its silence with the particular patience of geography that had been doing exactly this, without interruption, for 10,000 years before anyone had arrived to watch it, and would continue for 10,000 more after everyone had left. The fourth casualty happened on day 8. Private First Class Aaron Sims, 22 years old, from Provo, Utah. He was moving between buildings inside the FOB perimeter, a transit he'd made dozens of times. At a time of day he'd crossed that same ground before, when the round came. Clean entry, rear left quadrant of the helmet, 800 meters. Dawn light, the sun just clearing the eastern ridge and throwing long, specific shadows westward across the open ground. The shooter had found a position inside the FOB's established blind spot, a low ridge to the northwest that their terrain analysis had rated as low threat because of its angle relative to the primary activity areas, and because the elevation differential made it a harder technical shot. It was not a low-threat position. It was a patient position, one that required waiting for a specific combination of sun angle and target exposure that only existed for approximately 40 minutes each morning when the light was right and the shadows pointed in the useful direction. Someone had done that math, probably days before the shot. Emily stood in the TOC with Donovan and Webb and said nothing while the intelligence officer briefed the timeline and the ballistic reconstruction. She was running the geometry in her own head, the northwest ridge, the sun angle, the specific window during which Sims's transit had been visible from that position. The fact that their observation posture had been oriented entirely toward the northern arc, based on the previous 3 incidents. He had repositioned while they were watching the wrong direction. He'd let them establish a focus and then operated in the space that focus created. "He changed position," she said when the brief ended. Donovan nodded. He'd been nodding slowly the entire time, she realized. The slow nod of someone confirming a developing picture rather than receiving new information. "Northwest ridge," she continued. "He moved there after the first 3 shots established our attention on the northern arc. He was probably already in the new position while we were still orienting on the north." She looked at the map. The terrain made its geometry visible. "He used our attention as cover. He understood what we would watch and moved through what we weren't watching." "He used our attention against us," Donovan said. "That's in your manual," she said. "Chapter 7, a pause, page 93. Webb looked between them. "Can you find him?" Donovan looked at Emily. She said, "We need to stop reacting to where he was and start predicting where he's going." Donovan set up a session in the briefing room that evening. He pulled every incident, every ballistic reconstruction, every terrain photograph and satellite overlay, and arranged them on the wall in chronological order. Then he walked Emily through them with the same methodical patience he'd applied to stalking lane debriefs at Benning, not pointing at the obvious features, but at the spaces between them, the relationships, the logic. "What does he always have?" Donovan said. "Elevation advantage over the target." Emily studied the incident photographs. "Every position is uphill from the engagement point. And," she looked at the terrain, "egress. Every position has at least 2 concealed exit routes. He never commits to a position without a minimum of 2 ways out." She moved to the next photograph. "And concealment from the direction he's shooting from. He's never silhouetted against the sky from the target sightline." "What doesn't he have?" She thought about it carefully. "Wind advantage. He's consistently shooting crosswind or into the wind, never with it behind him." She looked at Donovan. "Why?" "Speculation," he said. "He's avoiding positions where the wind gives him a natural advantage because those positions are the obvious ones. A shooter at his level avoids the obvious on principle." She worked through it. "Or, he's not comfortable with downwind ballistic compensation. It's a more complex calculation, and if he wasn't trained on it specifically—" "The supplemental document I wrote in 2015, Donovan said carefully, "did not include a section on downwind compensation. I intended to add it in a revision that was never completed." Emily stared at him. So whoever has that document has a specific gap, a gap they may not know they have. He tapped the incident map, which is why he's consistently chosen crosswind positions, even when downwind options offered better concealment. He's steering around a hole in his training. Donovan sat down. For the first time since Salerno, his expression was something close to predatory. Not angry, focused in the way that preceded action. We know something he doesn't know we know. We can predict where he won't go, Emily said, which tells us where he will. The supply route interdiction the following morning confirmed the methodology. A convoy attempting to bring fuel and medical resupply from the district center encountered fire at a narrow pass 6 kilometers north. 2 vehicles disabled, 1 soldier wounded. The round had clipped the door pillar instead of finding the window, which was the difference between a casualty and a fatality, and was also information about the shooter's current position and angle. The firing position was exactly where Donovan's analysis said it would be. He was already gone by the time the QRF arrived, but he had been exactly where they predicted. That was something. Reyes got hit on the 12th day. They were on the overwatch shelf, positioned before first light in the darkness that preceded dawn by nearly an hour. Emily had the scope on the northern ridgeline, running her standard scan. Reyes was beside her, his spotting scope working the same arc. The round came from the south-southeast, lower elevation than their position. An uphill shot, technically more demanding, presenting greater atmospheric challenges, requiring a more complex holdover calculation. She had assessed uphill shooting from that angle as unlikely. The difficulty-to-reward ratio made it a suboptimal choice for a shooter who had other options available. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about the assumption that an expert shooter would take the easier shot. The round took Reyes through the left shoulder, below the clavicle, exiting cleanly on the backside. It missed his lung by 4 centimeters. He didn't lose consciousness. He made a compressed, involuntary noise and then said, "I'm okay," in a voice that was doing its best to be convincing. Emily was on the radio before he finished the sentence. She called for QRF, called in the grid, pressed her offhand against the entry wound with direct pressure while keeping her firing hand on the rifle and her eye sweeping the southern arc. She did not find him. He was already gone. She told herself the clinical facts. Reyes would survive. The wound was serious but not life-threatening if they got him treatment within the hour, which they would. He would be medevaced, and he would heal, and he might come back to operational status. She also told herself the tactical fact. She had made an incorrect assessment, and Reyes had paid part of the price for it. She kept the 2 facts separate. They were both true. Combining them into something emotional was a luxury she didn't have on a ridgeline, where there might be a follow-up shot. She told Donovan when she returned to the FOB with Reyes, sat in the medical station while the PA worked on the shoulder, and spoke in the flat, precise language of a debrief. The uphill shot, her prior assessment of it as unlikely, the angle, the elevation differential, the additional ballistic complexity that she had calculated as a deterrent. Donovan listened without interrupting. His left leg was extended at the specific angle it required, and she could see the fatigue in the set of his shoulders. Not weakness, accumulated effort. He'd been on terrain that was asking more of his body than his body was currently designed to give. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He practiced the edge cases," he said. "Yes, the gaps in your document, he filled them in himself. He didn't just absorb the methodology, he extended it. He's better than I expected." Donovan said it with the neutrality of an honest assessment, not a concession. "That's not useful to me right now," Emily said. "No," he agreed, "it's not." He looked at his hands resting on his knees. "We need to change our approach." She found Donovan at 0200 sitting outside the TOC with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. She sat beside him on the sandbag. The half-moon had cleared the eastern ridge and was throwing pale, silver light across the mountain faces, turning them to something lunar and abstract. The FOB was quiet in the specific way of military installations at this hour. Not silent, but reduced. Generator hum. A dog barking twice on the perimeter and then going quiet. The sound of the mountains being what they had always been. "You're second-guessing your doctrine," she said. He looked at the mountains rather than at her. "I'm asking whether a methodology that can be reverse-engineered by an adversary is worth teaching." Every methodology can be reverse-engineered with enough time and access. Not every methodology kills 4 American soldiers when the access occurs. She let that sit. There was no good answer to it, and she knew better than to manufacture one. "You've been treating yourself as the cause since the TOC briefing at Benning," she said, "before you'd even assessed the situation. I wrote the document. I authorized the distribution. You shared methodology with Allied forces because it worked and you believed in the alliance and the mission required it." She paused. "That's not a mistake. That's a correct decision that produced an outcome you didn't anticipate. The gap between those two things is where soldiers die. The gap between those two things is where soldiers always die," she said. "That gap never closes completely. It narrows with better intelligence, better doctrine, better training. It never reaches zero." She turned to face him. "You know that. You've known it for 40 years. Donovan turned his cold coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Knowing it and watching it happen are not the same experience." "No," she said, "they're not." They sat in silence for a while. The generator cycled up. The dog did not bark again. The mountains held the moonlight with complete indifference to what was happening at their base. "He'll move again soon," Donovan said. "He'll want to apply pressure before we can adapt our observation posture. I know, I've been thinking about positions he hasn't used yet, ones that fit his criteria, but that we haven't included in our threat assessment because they're outside our habitual observation arc." She spread her map on the sandbag between them. He leaned in, reading it in the moonlight with the ease of someone for whom map reading had become a sense rather than a skill. "He'll try to get inside your pattern," Donovan said. "After the Overwatch shelf, after Reyes, he knows you're the shooter, and he's been observing your observation habits the same way you've been analyzing his." Emily looked at him. "How would he know my habits?" "Because he's patient enough to watch you." Donovan straightened. "He doesn't just shoot, he observes. He gathers intelligence the same way we do. He's been studying your patterns, your timing, your preferred positions." He paused. "You've been watching the terrain. He's been watching you." The cold came off the mountains with the directness of something that had been waiting for the temperature to drop. Emily thought, "I've been looking in the right direction and watching the wrong thing." Webb called her in the next morning with the logistics situation laid out in plain language. The northern supply route was now effectively closed. 2 more convoy attempts in the previous 48 hours had been turned back by threat assessment. The actual threat didn't need to materialize if its presence was established credibly enough to make movement prohibitive. The ghost of the shooter's presence was doing the work of several active shooters. FOB Salerno was running on reserve fuel. Medical resupply at 60%. Ammunition adequate for current operations, but not for a sustained escalation. If the situation continued for another 10 days without resolution, Webb said, they would be in an operational bind that would require either reinforcement or consolidation. "We need this resolved," he said. "Not pressure, fact." The kind of flat statement that military officers made when they trusted the people they were talking to and didn't need to add force to the information. Emily looked at Donovan. "Give us 72 hours, Donovan said. "You have 60, Webb said. Outside the TOC, walking toward the briefing room in the morning heat, Emily said, "We don't have a plan yet." "We have the beginning of one," Donovan said. "What's the beginning?" "We know he's been watching you, so we let him watch something we want him to see." He pushed open the briefing room door. "We show him a pattern, and then we exploit the pattern we've shown him." They spent 12 hours building the deception operation. Emily ran observation patterns from 2 established positions she'd actually used, visible in the terrain analysis, authentic enough to register as genuine behavior to anyone watching. She moved at specific times, establishing a rhythm that had the right amount of variation to seem natural. Dawn observation, return before 0800, evening observation from 1730 to dark. On the third repetition, she varied the timing by 20 minutes. On the fourth, she shortened the evening window. She was constructing the impression of a shooter adapting to threat while actually creating a baseline predictable enough to be calculated. Donovan coached from the TOC via encrypted radio. He'll need 3 full cycles before he commits to the pattern as reliable, Donovan said. Possibly 4. He's not going to make assumptions on insufficient data. He's patient, Emily said. Patient and careful are related but not identical. A pause. He'll verify before he acts. On the 5th day, Donovan called her back to the briefing room with new information. A local source, Pashto speaking, 4-year working relationship with the FOB, verified through 2 separate intelligence channels, had reported a single man with a large military-style pack moving through the Eastern Ridge Trail 2 nights earlier. Moving slowly, resting at intervals. The source described him as Western in build and equipment, not tribal, not local contract worker, not consistent with anyone the source recognized. Emily studied the red notations Donovan had added to the map. That's the Karim Baba ridgeline. Yes. 4 kilometers from any of my established observation positions. Yes. She looked at him. That's not where I predicted. No, Donovan said. It's not where I predicted either. He paused. It's where I would have gone. She understood it immediately. He's not just using your doctrine, he's thinking like you. He may have studied more than the technical documents. Donovan's voice was level in the way that preceded something significant. In the distribution package to the Georgian school, there was a biographical and contextual note about the development of the methodology. Operational case studies. I wrote them myself. They're detailed, specific enough to illustrate the reasoning behind the doctrine, not just the mechanics. He knows how you think. He knows how I thought 15 years ago. Donovan looked at the map. The question is whether my thinking has changed enough to be genuinely unpredictable to him, or whether what he knows is current enough to still work. Emily thought about that for a moment. Has it changed? He looked at her. It was a long look. That's what we're about to find out. The night infiltration was Donovan's concept and Emily's execution. They moved at 0100 under 60% cloud cover. Black on black, no moon visible. The stars present but not useful for the kind of light she needed. Emily had the M40A6 in the padded drag bag slung across her back, balanced, secured, ready to be brought up in under 40 seconds from full carry. Donovan moved with her for the first kilometer on the lower terrain, then fell behind as the gradient increased and his left leg began making its demands. At the point where the trail turned vertical, he stopped her. 3 approach routes to Karim Baba. He handed her a GPS overlay, the screen dimmed to minimum. He'll have observation on 2 of them, probably the most obvious 2. He'll expect us to approach from the east or the north because those routes provide the best cover in the final approach. Which one won't he watch? Donovan's finger found a route on the overlay. A dry creek bed running along the western face. Below treeline, under natural overhead cover, poor sightlines from above, exposed to flash flooding if the weather changed, and technically the most physically demanding approach available. It was the worst route by almost every standard metric. He won't expect anyone to use it, Donovan said, because it's genuinely bad. A bad route chosen deliberately looks different from a bad route chosen through poor planning. He'll have eliminated it from his threat assessment. You're not telling me to use it, Emily said. I'm showing you where he isn't watching. The decision is yours. She took the creek bed. 400 meters took 3 hours. The rocks were unstable in the darkness, and she moved by feel more than sight. The GPS on her wrist at minimum brightness, giving her bearing, but not detail. She stopped every 20 minutes and lay completely still for 5, listening to the terrain, the wind through the rock formations, the shift of loose shale, the absence of any sound that had human intention behind it. On the third stop, she heard something. Distant, stone on stone, the particular sound of weight shifting on loose rock rather than wind-moved debris. She froze. She counted. 60 seconds. 2 minutes. The sound did not repeat. Donovan. Minimum volume. Copy. Contact sound. Possible. South-southwest of my position. Single occurrence. Did not repeat. Hold. She held for 22 minutes in the cold creek bed, breathing slowly, listening to everything. Nothing repeated. She continued. She reached the eastern approach to the Karim Baba ridgeline at 0430. 2 hours until first light, time enough to get position before the shooter would logically be active. If Donovan's read on the pattern held, she moved up the final approach with the drag bag catching on rocks she had to work free with careful, quiet deliberation. At the crest, she found the hide, exactly as Donovan had described in his classroom lectures. Low profile, rear covered by a natural rock formation that suppressed her silhouette from 3 directions. 2 egress routes visible from the position, overhead cover from aerial observation. Scrape marks in the dirt where a body had lain for extended periods, the depth of the depressions suggesting repeated occupation rather than a single stay. A shallow excavation for the bipod legs. 3 plastic water bottle caps arranged with unconscious neatness at the right margin of the position. A folded rectangle of cloth, a shooting mat, she confirmed by texture, tucked into a rock crevice for retrieval. Empty. She went completely still and assessed. He had been here recently, the scrape marks fresh enough to retain tool marks that hadn't yet been eroded by wind. But he wasn't here now. He had moved before she had, which meant one of 2 things. He had better intelligence on her movement than she'd accounted for, or he had simply been operating on a timeline that preceded her arrival for reasons unrelated to her. Either possibility was concerning. She radioed Donovan. He's gone, position still warm, 8 to 12 hours, maybe less. A pause that was longer than the tactical situation required. He moved before we did, Donovan said. Yes. Another pause. She could hear him thinking, not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the specific silence of someone recalculating a picture that had just changed. Emily stood up carefully and looked at the valley below. The FOB lights were visible to the west, pale in the pre-dawn. She could see 3 natural approach corridors to Salerno from this elevation. She could see the shepherd trail running along the valley floor, a centuries-old path between villages that local families used to move livestock between pastures, predictable in its timing because the animals set the schedule. And from this elevation, she could see something that hadn't been visible on the 2-dimensional terrain map. A second ridgeline. Closer to the FOB than Karim Baba. Lower elevation. Technically a harder shot, longer crosswind calculation, less concealment from behind. But with direct, unobstructed sightlines to the main gate, the medical station, and the helicopter landing pad. 3 high-value targets in a single observation window. And the shepherd trail ran directly along its base. Daily traffic, consistent timing, entirely civilian, entirely legitimate. She understood what he was planning. A shooter approaching that ridgeline along the shepherd trail with a large pack, moving slowly, would be indistinguishable from a local farmer or herder to anyone observing at distance. He could access a firing position in full daylight, in plain sight, because he would appear to belong there. And once positioned, he would have access to 3 targets of significant psychological and operational value. Donovan, her voice was controlled. I found his next position. She described the ridgeline, the sightlines, the shepherd trail, the geometry of the approach. Silence. Then, the civilian path. Yes. Emily, another pause. From where you are, do you have a shot at that ridgeline? She was already ranging it, 1,240 meters, crosswind at her current elevation. The full read was incomplete. She hadn't had time to properly assess the wind gradient between her position and the target. The shepherd traffic would begin at first light, which was 90 minutes away, possibly less. The shot is possible, she said, not confirmed. I need more wind data. It's a long shot under incomplete conditions. I know. If you take it and miss, you alert him and he relocates. We lose the position intelligence. He moves to something we can't predict. I know. If you wait, he reaches that ridgeline with civilian cover and the shot becomes legally and operationally impossible. I know. She lay down behind the M40A6, settled her cheek against the stock with a consistency of 10,000 repetitions. Ranged the ridgeline again. 1,243 meters. The wind up here was northwest, 8 knots, but she could see from the dust movement in the valley that the wind down there was different, variable in the transition zone between the ridges, running in a direction she couldn't confirm from her current position. She thought about the classroom. Precision requires certainty. Certainty is a form of arrogance. She thought about Mosul, the figure in the doorway, the half-second. She thought about what she'd said to Donovan that afternoon in August, in a classroom with fluorescent lights humming and a whiteboard behind her. I'm not taking the shot, she said. A beat on the radio. Explain your reasoning. 1,200 meters plus, unread wind transition, pre-dawn light, no confirmed visual ID of target. She pulled back from the scope. That's not a precision shot. That's an educated guess at a range that doesn't allow for educated guessing. If I miss, I lose him and possibly warn him. And the wind transition means I might hit something else. She kept her voice level. I'm not taking that shot. The radio was quiet. Not the silence of disagreement, something else. He won't approach along the shepherd trail in daylight, she said, working through it as she spoke. He'll use it as cover for an approach in low light, before first light or at last light, which means he's either on approach right now or he comes in during the evening window, or he's already positioned and waiting. If he's already positioned, we have a different problem. She was already moving to her feet. I'm not going to sit on this ridgeline and wait for him to reach a position that gives him every advantage and gives us nothing. I'm going to find him on approach. A pause, then, Carter, Sergeant, that is not what I taught you. My doctrine teaches you to hold position and acquire the target, not to maneuver toward it. Your doctrine also teaches that patience is about waiting for the right moment, she said. Not waiting in the right place indefinitely. I'm done waiting in the wrong place. She was moving, keeping low along the Karim Baba crest line, heading north toward the descent. I'm going to hunt him. The longest pause yet. Then, use the secondary creek drainage as cover. It runs parallel to the shepherd trail and brings you within 400 meters of the lower ridgeline. At 400 meters, you're inside your confirmed engagement envelope and out of the worst of the wind transition zone. She stopped. You're not telling me not to go, she said. No, Donovan said. I'm not. A beat that had weight in it. I'm telling you how to do it right. She moved differently now. Not the careful, measured crawl of the overwatch position. Not the patient stillness of a shooter waiting for geometry to align. Something older. The particular movement that emerged when the hunter stopped thinking about the target and started thinking like it. Where does it want to be? What does it need? Where will it feel safe? She descended the eastern face of Karim Baba by feel, keeping her weight back on the slope, testing each footfall before committing. The drag bag rode tight against her back, balanced. If she fell, the rifle would survive. That was the priority, and she did not argue with the priority. The creek drainage Donovan had identified was 30 meters below the Shepherd Trail, invisible from it, running between walls of compressed shale that muffled sound and broke line of sight in both directions. She found the entrance in the darkness by almost stepping into it, the ground simply dropping away into a channel 2 meters deep and barely wide enough for her shoulders and the drag bag. She lowered herself and started moving north. The drainage smelled like old water and mineral deposits in the specific cold stone smell of a place that saw sunlight only briefly each day. She moved in a low crouch, the rifle across her forearms in the drag position, placing each foot with deliberate care on the compressed shale floor. The shale gave under pressure rather than cracking. Useful. "Radio check," Donovan said. "Solid copy. Minimum volume, lips close to the handset. Wind at the valley floor is 4 to 6 knots, south-southwest. Variable. Dust movement near the lower ridgeline suggests it's picking up below the rock shelf. Account for it. Copy. Emily," a pause with weight in it. "He's good. Don't underestimate the approach." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." Another pause. "It's what I say when I'm worried and I don't have a better way to say it." She almost smiled. She did not smile. It was not the moment, but she filed it away. The image of Jack Donovan, 62 years old with a bad leg and 40 years of operational history, admitting to worry in the language of someone who'd spent those 40 years not having words for what he felt. Everything arrives mixed. She kept moving. The drainage curved north and then west, following the old water logic of the mountain, and after 40 minutes of movement, she felt the terrain change. The walls shallowed. The floor widened. The ambient sound of the open valley returned around her in stages. She went to her stomach. She inched forward until she could see over the drainage lip without exposing her silhouette. The lower ridgeline was 280 meters to the northwest, closer than she'd calculated. She'd covered more ground than the GPS suggested, probably because the drainage curve had taken her northwest as well as north. The ridgeline was a rough shelf of darker rock, 20 meters wide, with natural backstop cover from a boulder cluster that would suppress sound from below and provide visual concealment from the valley floor. She studied it for 3 minutes, then 4, then 5. On the 5th minute, she saw him. Not clearly, not a full figure, a shape at the left edge of the boulder cluster that had the specific quality of controlled stillness. The outline of something deliberately motionless, which was paradoxically more visible than natural movement because nothing in nature achieved the sustained, precise immobility of a trained human being choosing not to be seen. He was already in position. He was ahead of her timeline. Either he had moved faster than she'd predicted, or he had been in position longer than her reconstruction of his movements suggested. Both options meant he was operating at a higher level than her current model accounted for. She filed that assessment and did not let it become fear. She went completely motionless. She radioed Donovan at minimum volume, lips against the handset. "He's there. Left edge, boulder cluster, already down. Range? 280. Wind? South-southwest. 5 knots at my position. Probably less at his. The boulder cluster will break it on his side." A pause in which Donovan was doing the complete calculation. Not just the math, the full operational picture. Range, wind, elevation differential, her position, the Shepherd Trail below, the FOB lights to the west, the angle of approach, the egress geometry if the shot was missed or the target was missed. "You have the shot," he said. "I know. But you don't have a confirmed ID." "I know." A shape in a boulder cluster, military stillness, a drag bag she could now see against the rock with the tags in a military format she could identify in style, if not in specific number. He was in the prone position. She was certain from the angle of his body relative to the rock shelf in front of him, the way his silhouette compressed against the ground. He was waiting for light. He was waiting for the FOB to show him targets, and there was still a shepherd on the path below. An elderly man with 2 goats moving westward at the pace that goats set, which was their pace and not his. He would be out of the impact zone in approximately 7 minutes. Possibly less if the goats cooperated. Possibly more if they didn't. She watched the shape in the boulder cluster. She thought about Mosul. She thought about the figure in the doorway, the half-second, the decision that had been technically correct and humanly imperfect, and that she had been carrying for 2 years in the particular way of something that was not going to put itself down voluntarily. Precision requires certainty. Donovan, still minimum volume. The supplemental document from 2015, does it include protocol for target confirmation in low-light conditions? Yes, a beat. Why? He was trained to do a pre-engagement terrain sweep to confirm isolation before he shoots. It's in the document. He'll sweep the approach terrain before he engages the FOB. She kept her eyes on the shape. When he sweeps right, his scope face will catch the ambient light from the eastern sky. Even minimal, it'll reflect. Silence on the radio. That's a very thin confirmation threshold, Donovan said finally. It's what the conditions give me. A longer silence. She could feel him working through it, the ethics, the doctrine, the risk calculation, the fact that he was 2 kilometers away with a bad leg and a radio, tracking this on encrypted audio while she was 280 meters from the man who had killed 4 American soldiers using his methodology. Your call, Donovan said. I've given you everything I have. The decision is yours. She breathed out, slowly, completely. The shape in the boulder cluster moved. A micro-adjustment of the shoulders. The preparatory shift of a shooter settling into final position. Confirming cheek weld, confirming stock contact. As the shoulders rotated through the adjustment, the scope face caught the first gray light coming off the eastern ridge. A flash, brief, unmistakable. She saw the reticle reflection, the bipod legs against the rock shelf, the drag bag tag in military format, close enough to read the style, if not the number. A man in a prone position with a long rifle waiting for light to bring him targets. Confirmed. She held. She held for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. This was not in any doctrine she had been taught. The manual addressed when to shoot, the conditions, the confirmation, the wind calls, the range data, the moment when all factors were within acceptable tolerances. It did not address the specific circumstance of having a confirmed target in your reticle at 280 meters and choosing to wait. She was waiting because she needed to understand what he was going to shoot before she stopped him. A body and a rifle told Webb's people that the threat was neutralized. They did not tell them whether there was a network, a handler, a secondary shooter, or a contract that would simply be fulfilled by the next person in line. She needed him to demonstrate his target selection, to reveal his operational priority before she ended the operational question. She also needed the shepherd to clear the impact zone. The shepherd was still moving. One of the goats had stopped to investigate something in the path with the complete commitment of an animal that had no schedule and no awareness that schedules existed. The old man was coaxing it forward with the patient persistence of someone who had been doing exactly this for many years and had stopped expecting speed from animals or from anything else. Move, she thought, without urgency. Take your time. Just move. The shape in the boulder cluster went completely still. Final position. He had identified his first target. She could tell from the specific quality of his stillness, the last micro-movement before a shot, the cessation of all the small adjustments of positioning and settling into something absolute. He was going to engage the main gate. She could read it from his body angle relative to the FOB geometry below. The shift change was his target window. She had 2 minutes, maybe less. The goat moved. The shepherd moved with it. They rounded the western curve of the path and passed behind an outcropping that put 50 meters of solid rock between them and the ridgeline. "He's about to engage," she told Donovan. "I know, I can see the gate feed from the TOC. Webb's held the shift change." A pause. "When you're ready." She hadn't known Webb was holding the shift change. Something loosened slightly in her chest. The specific relief of discovering that the people around you had been thinking and moving while you were executing. That you were not operating alone even when you were operating alone. She put the reticle center on the shape in the boulder cluster. She made her final wind call. South-southwest. 4 knots with the boulder cluster reducing it at his position. Adjusted accordingly. She read the range, 278 meters. She confirmed her cheek weld, checked her left shoulder, released the compensation she'd been unconsciously holding. She thought about the classroom in August, the fluorescent lights. One shot changes a war. She thought about Donovan saying, "I care what you do when I am watching and when I am not." She thought about Mosul. She acknowledged it, the full weight of it, the permanence of what a trigger pull meant. The fact that this weight would not leave and was not supposed to leave. And then she set it to one side. Not down, to one side. It would be there when she was done. She broke the shot. The round hit. She knew it before she heard it. The shape in the boulder cluster dropped in the specific way of a body going suddenly inert. Not a fall, not a dramatic collapse. Simply a cessation of all the controlled, deliberate stillness that had preceded it. One moment it was a person choosing to be motionless. The next it was weight obeying gravity with no will behind it. The distinction was absolute and visible even at this range. Emily held her position. She stayed down for 4 full minutes, sweeping the surrounding terrain in slow, deliberate arcs. She was looking for a secondary shooter, a spotter, a reaction element, any indication that he had not been operating alone. She checked the ridgeline to his east and west. She checked the slope below the boulder cluster. She checked the shepherd trail, now empty, and the approach drainage she'd used. She checked the sky. Nothing moved with human intention. "Impact confirmed," she said into the radio. The words came out level and controlled. She noted her own steadiness with the distant clinical interest of someone monitoring a system. She could hear the TOC in the background of Donovan's transmission. Voices, movement, the controlled activation of a command element that had been waiting in held breath and was now moving into action. Then his voice, close. "Copy. Are you clear?" "Clear. Stay down 5 more minutes, then fall back on the drainage." "Copy." She stayed down for 7. Donovan had taught her in the first week at Benning. The number you give yourself is always optimistic. Add 30%. She had internalized it as a number. She applied it as a principle. When she finally moved, she went at the same pace as the approach. Not because the primary threat remained, but because threat geometry didn't change based on what you'd just done. There could be observations she hadn't detected. She moved back into the drainage and traveled 200 meters north before she allowed herself to stand fully upright. The sun was clearing the eastern ridge. It turned the shale walls of the drainage gold and amber and threw long shadows pointing west. She followed the shadows out of the drainage and began the return movement toward the FOB. And she thought about almost nothing for the 45 minutes the movement required. She let the terrain do the thinking. She put one foot after the other on the rocks and the packed earth and the goat trail that eventually connected to the gravel road that led to the FOB gate. She thought, this part is done. Then she thought, this part is done. Not all of it. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. The QRF reached the lower ridge line 40 minutes after she called it in. Emily was back at the FOB by then, in the briefing room with a cup of coffee she was drinking without tasting, and her M40A6 field stripped on the table in front of her. She was cleaning it not because it needed cleaning urgently, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind processed the morning. Cleaning was automatic. The process ran on one track while everything else ran on another. The QRF sergeant radioed his initial assessment at 0712. 1 KIA, male, approximately 40 to 50 years, Western physical profile, military-grade equipment, suppressed bolt-action rifle, custom bipod, laser rangefinder, weather meter, full optics suite, no identification documents, no phone or communication device, consistent with a professional operating in denied status. Colonel Webb looked at Donovan. Donovan was standing at the map with his arms crossed, looking at the northern ridgeline positions they had spent 2 weeks watching. The wrong positions, as it turned out. But that had been part of the design, too. Rifle? Donovan said. The QRF sergeant described it in detail. Donovan listened with his eyes still on the map. Georgian manufacture, military contract, post-2018 production configuration. He looked at Webb. That confirms the supply chain and the timeline both. We need biometrics before we can confirm identity, Webb said. Give us 72 hours. You'll get a name, Donovan said. The name will trace somewhere. That somewhere will trace to whoever contracted him. He paused. That part is yours to work. The threat here is resolved. Webb looked at Emily. Good work, Sergeant Carter. She nodded in the way that communicated professional acknowledgement without either false modesty or performance of confidence. Then she looked back at the barrel she was running the bore brush through. Webb left. The TOC staff filtered back to their stations. After a moment, Donovan sat down across the table from her and watched her work without speaking. She ran the patch. She ran it again. She held the barrel to the light and checked the bore with the headlamp. The bore was clean. She checked it again. You held, Donovan said. She set the barrel section down. I held. Confirmed shot at 280 meters. You held for nearly 4 minutes. The shepherd wasn't clear. That's one reason. He rested his forearms on the table. What were the others? She looked at him. Intelligence value. If there was a network or a secondary element in theater, taking him before he committed to an action meant Webb's people would have a body with no operational context to work from. The site exploitation, the equipment signature, the biometrics, the target selection, all of that required him to demonstrate intent before I ended it. She picked up the barrel again. A dead shooter with no confirmed operational picture is worth less than a dead shooter who just revealed exactly what he was doing and how. Donovan nodded slowly. And? She ran the patch again. And I needed to be certain. Not probable, not highly likely, certain. She set the patch down. After Mosul, I made a rule for myself. If the tactical situation permits waiting for certainty, I wait. If it doesn't permit it, I accept the risk and act. But if it permits it, you wait, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The briefing room was quiet around them. The generator hum coming through the walls. The distant sound of the QRF helicopters returning to the pad. The ordinary sounds of a forward operating base that had just had something resolved that had been unresolved for 6 weeks. In 40 years, Donovan said, I have never had a student hold a confirmed shot at under 300 meters for operational and confirmation reasons and still make the follow-on shot clean. He paused. I don't know if that's something I can teach. You did teach it, Emily said. You taught me that patience is about the right moment, not just the right place. She reassembled the lower receiver. I just applied it to a situation you didn't design the lesson for. That's the definition of mastery, he said quietly. She looked up at him. He was not being rhetorical. He was stating an assessment. She looked back at the rifle. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The name came back in 61 hours. Alexei Marchuk, Ukrainian national, 43 years old, former military, trained through the Georgian Army Sniper Program in 2020 under the NATO Capacity Building Initiative. Recruited by a private military company called Sentinel Arc Solutions in late 2021. The company dissolved on paper in 2022, but its operational network remained intact, operating through a constellation of contracting shells across Central Asia and the Middle East. Marchuk's prior operational record, reconstructed through biometric databases and allied intelligence sharing, showed 11 confirmed kills in 3 theaters before Afghanistan. All precision, long range, all attributed post hoc to various insurgent groups, attributions that had never fully satisfied the intelligence analysts who wrote them, but had been accepted because the alternative raised uncomfortable questions about the origin and training of the shooters involved. Webb briefed it in the TOC with a DIA analyst who had been quiet in the background since Benning and was now doing the opposite, and 2 additional intelligence officers who had flown in from Bagram overnight. Sentinel Arc is the 3rd private military company in 18 months we've tracked exploiting advanced sniper doctrine derived from Allied training programs, the analyst said. Marchuk's operational profile, reconstructed from site exploitation, trajectory analysis, and the pattern of his prior confirmed engagements, is consistent with at least 2 other source documents beyond the Georgian school materials. He was a student who studied broadly. Donovan stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed. Emily watched him. She could see what he was doing with his face, the specific work of processing something that had ethical weight and no clean resolution. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. The recognition that the problem was larger than the specific instance they just resolved. "It's not just your manual," Emily said to him quietly, after the brief when the room was clearing. "No." He looked at the door the DIA analyst had walked through. "It's the doctrine-sharing framework at a systemic level. Which is the correct policy? Sharing methodology with allies makes the alliance genuinely stronger. It also creates risk surface that we haven't been adequately tracking." He paused. "The policy isn't wrong. The monitoring of where the doctrine goes after distribution, that's what's inadequate. Can it be fixed? Better than it is now." He looked at her with the particular directness that preceded something important. "That's going to require people who understand both sides of the problem, the creation and the exploitation. People who've been trained in the methodology and have seen what it looks like when the methodology is turned against them." He paused. "People who can sit in a briefing room and know, from personal experience, exactly what the other side knows." She understood what he was saying. She didn't respond to it directly. There would be time for that conversation, and this was not the moment for it. The moment required something else, not decisions about what came next, but the acknowledgement of what had just been completed. "You want coffee?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I want coffee." They flew out of Salerno on a Thursday. The helicopter banked east over the mountains as it gained altitude, and Emily watched the ridge lines scroll past below through the cargo window. The Karim Baba Shelf, the shepherd trail along the valley floor, catching the morning light. The secondary creek drainage she'd moved through in darkness. The lower ridgeline with its boulder cluster, which from this altitude was just rock. One formation among many, identical to the geography around it in every observable way except for what had happened there 4 hours ago. She looked at it until the helicopter's angle took it out of her sightline. Donovan was across from her in the cargo hold, head back against the webbing, eyes closed. His left leg was extended at the angle it needed. Not quite a natural position, a specific accommodation. She had watched him move through this terrain for 2 weeks. The extra weight each slope demanded. The specific technique he used on loose rock to minimize stress on the old shrapnel damage. The things he had never mentioned, never used as a reason or an excuse, never let anyone see as a limitation. He had simply accounted for them and kept moving. She thought, that's not in any manual either. She thought about what was in the manuals and what wasn't. The doctrine captured the mechanics, the calculations, the positions, the confirmation protocols, the win calls. It captured the what and the how. It did not capture the why that operated underneath those, the weight that made the why matter. The reason you waited for certainty, the reason you held a confirmed shot for 4 minutes in the dark because a shepherd was still on a path below. The reason the difference between a hit and a wrong hit was not a technical problem, but a moral one with technical dimensions. None of that was in any document. It was in proximity. It was in sitting beside someone at 0200 while they turned a cold coffee cup in their hands and told you that everything arrived mixed. It was in watching someone manage a bad leg across difficult terrain for 2 weeks without once making it someone else's problem. The helicopter moved south through clear morning air, and the mountains fell away and Afghanistan became a series of brown shapes, and then a general abstraction, and then nothing visible at all. Bagram smelled like jet fuel and institutional food, and the particular staleness of a place processing too many people in too little space. They had a 6-hour layover. Emily found a stretch of wall between a vending machine and a fire door, sat on the floor with her back to the concrete and her knees up, and looked at the middle distance. The terminal moved around her. Soldiers in transit, contractors in civilian clothes, the occasional family with a specific look of people trying very hard to appear normal in a place that was not normal. Donovan found her 20 minutes later. He assessed the floor, made his calculation, and lowered himself down with the careful economy of someone who had long since made peace with what his body required. They sat without speaking for a while. A flight was announced over the PA. Neither of them moved. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. "You can ask. In the TOC, when Webb gave us 60 hours, you asked for 72 first. Did you actually think 60 was enough?" He considered the question. "No," he said. "I thought we needed 90. Why did you say 72? Because asking for 90 would have told Webb we didn't have a plan. Asking for 72 said we had a plan with a margin. The margin was a fiction, but the plan became real because we had to make it real in 60 hours. He paused. "Sometimes the deadline is the plan." She thought about that. "Is that in your manual?" "No. Should it be?" He considered seriously. The things that should be in the manual and aren't are usually the things that can't survive being written down. Doctrine captures what can be repeated, what can be taught in a controlled environment and replicated under stress. It does not capture what you did in that drainage. The moment when you read the terrain and the situation and made a decision that my doctrine would have counseled against, but that was correct. He looked at her. "I cannot write that. I can only be near it until the proximity is enough." Emily looked at the terminal ceiling. Exposed ductwork, fluorescent panels, a long water stain that had dried into the shape of a river on a map, or a ridgeline, depending on the angle. "Donovan," she said. "Sergeant. The judgment, the part that isn't transferable through text." She paused. "Where did yours come from?" He was quiet. This was different from his other silences. Not calculating, not assessing. Something else. The quality of silence that preceded something true being said for the first time. "A village in Kuwait," he said, 1991. "I was 28 years old, and I had a perfect shot on a man who I had identified as a threat based on what I could see at 600 meters in transitional light." He paused. "I didn't take the shot because something felt wrong that I could not articulate at the time. It was not doctrine. It was not training protocol. It was something in the pattern of his movement that didn't match my threat model. The way he was carrying the object, the direction of his attention, something I processed below the level of conscious thought." He was quiet. "He was digging a well," Donovan said. "The object was a shovel." Emily said nothing. "I have never told that to a student before," Donovan said. "I was not certain it was useful. I thought it might read as a reason not to shoot rather than a reason to be precise. A story about hesitation rather than a story about the thing beneath hesitation." He looked at her. "But you said in the classroom that precision requires certainty, And that certainty is a form of arrogance. And that is exactly what I felt in Kuwait in 1991, and I had never had a word for it before. She held that. The civilian in Mosul, Emily said. It was the first time she had named it directly to another person since it happened. It wasn't a misidentification. I identified correctly, and the situation changed in the interval between identification and the shot. He moved into the doorway. He wasn't a threat. He was someone who opened a door at the wrong moment. The investigation found the shoot within doctrine, justified under ROE, technically correct. She paused. Technically correct, and a man who opened a door at the wrong moment is dead. Donovan said nothing. I've been asking myself for 2 years whether I needed to be faster or slower, she said. Whether I should have compressed the decision cycle or extended it. I've been treating it as a technique problem. She looked at her hands. It's not a technique problem. No, he said quietly. It's a weight problem. You carry it correctly or you don't. And carrying it correctly doesn't mean it gets lighter. It means you get stronger. She paused. It means the weight becomes part of your structure instead of something you're working against. Another flight was announced on the PA, their flight. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Donovan began the process of getting himself off the floor. The specific sequence his leg required. The sequence he had never made anyone else's problem. Emily stood first and offered a hand without making anything of it. He took it without making anything of it. They walked toward the gate. Carter, he said. Sergeant. For what it's worth, he didn't look at her, just walked with the rhythm his leg made. The man who opened the door in Mosul, he would not want you to stop pulling triggers. He would want you to pull them correctly. She said nothing. You already know that, Donovan said. I'm saying it anyway. It's what I say when I'm worried and I don't have a better way to say it. Fort Benning in October was different from Fort Benning in August. The humidity had broken. The tree line had changed. The native pines stayed green, but the hardwoods along the creek beds had gone amber and rust, and a particular deep red that looked, in the right afternoon light, like something that had been set on fire and was burning slowly and completely at peace with burning. Emily noticed this from the window of the administrative building, where she was completing her after-action paperwork 3 weeks after returning from Salerno, and she thought, I didn't see the trees when I arrived. I wasn't looking at them. She had been looking at other things. The remaining candidates from her original class had graduated in her absence. Voss had passed. She'd expected that. Of the 17 who'd started, 11 had finished. 2 fewer than Donovan's 11-year statistical average of the 40% attrition rate holding. The 2 additional losses were probably explained by the disruption to the training schedule that Donovan's temporary departure had caused, though the record would show no such explanation. Donovan had returned to Virginia, retired status, officially, for the 3rd time. She'd received 2 emails from him in 3 weeks, both brief, both containing information that was technically unsolicited, but precisely relevant to things she was currently working through. The first was a reference to a wind compensation study from the Army Marksmanship Unit that addressed a gap in the crosswind calculation protocol she'd identified during the Salerno deployment. The second was a 3-line observation about inconsistencies in how different sniper schools were teaching the Coriolis correction in lateral movement scenarios. She had responded to both within the hour. The paperwork she was completing was the formal operational after-action report, standard Army format, objective and third person, and deliberately incomplete in the ways that operational security required. She had also written a different version, a personal version, in her own notebook, in the particular cramped handwriting she used when she was writing for herself, rather than for a record. She had burned that notebook the day she completed it, which was not a doctrine-recommended records management procedure, but had served its purpose. Beside the formal AAR on her desk was a second document, a position recommendation form. The position was newly created. Senior Sniper Instructor with additional duties in doctrine, security, and Allied Training Risk Assessment, U.S. Army Sniper School, Fort Benning, Georgia. It had been newly created for 11 days, which was exactly how long it had taken Webb to route the proposal through the appropriate channels after Emily had submitted it. She had not consulted Donovan before submitting it. She had written it herself, gotten Webb and 2 other senior officers to co-sponsor it, and routed it through the system before she told anyone that the position existed. She wanted it to be an established fact before it became a conversation. She knew he would say yes. He would make a performance of considering it carefully. He would raise practical objections, the leg, the age, the fact of being recalled twice already, the question of whether the work was his to do anymore. He would use the word unnecessary at least once, possibly twice. And then he would say yes, because the work wasn't finished, because the gap between doctrine and doctrine security was still open, because there were people coming through this school who needed the proximity, and the proximity was the thing that couldn't be written down. And the thing that couldn't be written down was the only thing that actually transmitted what needed to be transmitted. She signed the recommendation form and put it in the routing envelope and set it in the outgoing tray. Then she picked up her rifle and went to the range. The graduation ceremony for the next class was on a Friday morning in November, cool enough that people's breath was visible in the air. Emily stood in the back of the formation in her instructor capacity, a role she had formally accepted after a 40-minute conversation with the school's commanding officer that had included the phrase, "You're exactly what this course needs right now," delivered without embellishment by someone who had already decided and was informing rather than persuading. Donovan stood at the front. He had arrived 2 days earlier, driving himself from Virginia in a truck that had more miles on it than made sense for someone who officially described himself as retired. On his first morning, he had appeared at the range without announcement and had spent 4 hours watching the current class run a stalking exercise without saying a single word to any of them. The candidates had found this unnerving. The other instructors had found it familiar. That evening, he had found Emily at the range house after the day's evaluations were logged. He had looked at her the way he looked at everything, with complete attention and no excess. "The third candidate in the first stalking lane," he said. "She has your tell. Left shoulder drop before the break." "I've been watching it develop," Emily said. "I'll work it with her this week." "You should. She's otherwise the strongest in the class." "I know," Emily said. "That's why I'm working it." He had nodded and gone to find his quarters. Now he stood before 11 newly certified U.S. Army snipers in the November air. He looked at them with the expression Emily had spent 4 months learning to read. Something between respect and warning. You have been given something that costs more than you currently understand, and the cost will arrive at times you don't expect. He spoke briefly. He was not a graduation ceremony man and made no effort to become one. He said the certificate they were receiving was not a credential. It was a starting point. He said the most dangerous moment in a sniper's career was immediately after qualification, when confidence exceeded experience. He said time was the only antidote to that gap, and time could not be compressed or substituted. Then he looked toward the back of the formation. The instructor standing at the back of this formation was, 8 months ago, a candidate in this course. She completed the course under conditions I cannot discuss in a public setting and did something I would not have predicted possible under those conditions. He paused. She also told me something in a classroom in August that I have thought about every day since. She said, "Precision requires certainty, and certainty is a form of arrogance." Another pause. "That is the most accurate single description of this work that I have encountered in 40 years of doing it. I want you to carry it." Emily stood in the back of the formation and kept her face neutral, which required some effort but was within her current capabilities. Afterward, in the parking lot, Donovan stopped beside her on his way to his truck. They stood in the November light, which was thin and clear and through long shadows. "The recommendation form," he said. "You got it. You submitted it without telling me." "Yes. I would have told you it was unnecessary." "I know." She looked at him. "And then you would have said yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You're more arrogant than you were in August." "I'm more certain," she corrected. "There's a meaningful distinction." He made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that the distinction didn't matter much. He opened the truck door and stood with one hand on the frame. "I'm going to need the curriculum documents by Monday. I want to restructure the environmental compensation section. It's missing downwind scenarios, and that gap has been in the material long enough. You'll have them Monday. And I want to add a unit on doctrine exploitation risk, how allied sharing can create adversarial capability, how to recognize your own methodology being used against you." He paused. "It's not in the current curriculum." "I've been drafting it," Emily said. "Since Salerno." He looked at her. "Of course you have." He got into the truck with the careful economy of someone who had made peace with what his body required and didn't make anyone else participate in that negotiation. "Monday, Carter." "Monday, Sergeant." She watched him drive out of the parking lot and turn east toward the highway and disappear into the tree line where the autumn hardwoods were still burning slowly with their particular patient fire. She ran the range alone that evening. No formal evolution, no data cards, no logbook, no wind calls recorded for anyone's review. She set up prone on the 1,000-yard line in the last of the afternoon light with the M40A6, and she breathed. In the way she'd been taught. Respiratory pause, natural, not forced. Not held breath. Held breath created pressure, and pressure created tremor. And tremor at 1,000 yards created outcomes that defeated the purpose. Natural pause, in the space between exhale and the next inhale, where the body was momentarily at rest in its own rhythm. The reticle floated over empty downrange space. No target, nothing to acquire. She let it float, and she watched the floating, the small, involuntary circles that even the best shooters could not fully eliminate because the human body was not a machine and had never been one. And the gap between machine precision and human precision was where everything interesting lived, where the discipline was, where the judgment was, where the weight was. She thought about what she'd carried to Fort Benning in August. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 commendation, 1 incident, a particular hesitation that she had spent 2 years misdiagnosing as a flaw in her technique, when it had actually been a correct instinct operating on information that had arrived fractionally too late to be useful. She thought about what she was carrying now, the same 2 tours, the same commendation, the incident, still there, still permanent, still the weight it had always been, but sitting differently inside her now. Not a wound she was navigating around, a scar she was navigating with. Part of the structure rather than an obstacle to the structure. Marchuk, the boulder cluster, the 4 minutes, the shepherd and his goats rounding the rock outcropping, the optic flash in the pre-dawn gray, the shot that she had taken with full certainty and full weight and full understanding of what it meant and what it cost. Donovan at Bagram on the floor of the terminal talking about Kuwait in 1991. The man with the shovel. The instinct he hadn't had a word for until August. He would not want you to stop pulling triggers. He would want you to pull them correctly. She thought about the candidates who would arrive at Fort Benning in January. 17 of them probably, maybe 18. Men and women who could shoot, who'd been sent here because someone in their chain of command believed they could shoot under conditions that made most people's hands shake badly enough that they couldn't operate a zipper. She would be the one who told them that. Standing in front of them at 0530 with a topographic map and a red lens flashlight in the Georgia pre-dawn. She thought about what she would say in the spaces between the doctrine, in the classroom, at the range, In the moments when a candidate did something they hadn't been taught, some instinct coming through that was better than the training, that had been developed in places the training couldn't reach, and she had to find a way to name it so they could find it again deliberately. She already knew what she would start with. Precision requires certainty. Certainty is a form of arrogance. She would start there. She would always start there. The light failed. The 1,000-yard line went from visible to theoretical, existing as a known fact rather than an observable one. She held the position for another 8 minutes in full darkness, which was itself a kind of training. The body learning to be still not because it could see the target, but because stillness was the habit, and the habit was the foundation, and the foundation was what held when everything else was stripped away. Then she rose, cleared the rifle, slung it, and walked back toward the building in the dark. 6 months later, a candidate named Reyes completed the stalking exercise. Not Corporal Danny Reyes from Albuquerque. He had healed fully. She'd gotten a brief email that said, "Shoulders good, Sergeant, thank you," with nothing else appended, which she'd appreciated for its completeness. This was Private First Class Maria Reyes, 24 years old, from San Antonio, who had the natural economy of movement that indicated real talent and the barely suppressed urgency that natural talent almost always produced as its liability. Reyes had gotten within 50 meters of the observer's position before being spotted. 50 meters. Donovan told Emily afterward, in the flat informational register he used for facts he found genuinely significant, that only 3 candidates in 11 years had gotten closer. Emily found Reyes cleaning her rifle in the barracks after the debrief. She sat on the sandbag across from her and watched for a moment without speaking. "You got spotted at 50, Emily said. "I know, Sergeant. Do you know why?" Reyes set down the bore brush. "I was in the correct window. I read the observer pattern. 42-second left sweep, 11 right. I moved in the left window." She paused. "I think my final approach was too fast." "Your pace was fine," Emily said. "Your left shoulder dropped before every movement initiation. It threw your silhouette 2 centimeters outside your grass cover at the point where Harold's scope was positioned." Reyes stared at her. "It's a compensatory pattern," Emily said, "developed in training environments where you were indexed against a surface on your left side. It's invisible at short range. At observation range, 2 centimeters is a flag." She stood. "We'll work it." "How long does it take to fix?" Reyes asked. Emily thought about that, about the range at Benning in August, the last of the summer light, a man sitting on a sandbag behind her saying, "Better, not fixed." About the 3 weeks he'd given her as a timeline for the new pattern beginning to compete with the old. 3 weeks of deliberate correction before the new pattern starts to compete with the habit, she said. Then another 3 before the habit starts to lose. She paused. But you can't unfeel a habit. You can feel it happening and choose differently. That's most of what this work is. Not the elimination of error, but the recognition of error and a deliberate choice. Reyes nodded, processing it seriously. She was the kind of candidate who received information as something to be used, rather than something to be acknowledged. Emily approved of that. "Sergeant Carter," Reyes looked up, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Did you always know that? The recognition and choice thing?" Emily thought about August, about Georgia humidity and a concrete pad, and a man who'd stop for 3 seconds on her face when everyone else got 2. About a classroom with fluorescent lights and a whiteboard, and a sentence that had been true before she'd said it and had become truer in the months since. About a drainage in darkness in Afghanistan, and a 4-minute hold at 280 meters, and a shepherd and his goats rounding a rock outcropping in the pre-dawn gray. "No," she said. "Someone taught me." She left Reyes with her rifle and walked out onto the range where the evening light was long and gold, and the pine trees were throwing shadows east, and the 1,000-yard line stretched into a distance that was clear and readable, and full of wind she could already feel, and already calculate, and already, In some way, she had stopped trying to fully articulate trust. She no longer pulled the trigger to end lives. She pulled it to teach others when not to.